computer. Okay, so starting again, reading Midrash and reading Midrash on Purim. We're going to look today at some Midrashim on, or a Midrash on Vashti. Chazal give a lot of space to her relative to the amount of verses that she gets in the actual book. She gets a huge amount of play. So obviously for the rabbis, Vashti Vashti is calling out to the rabbis, interpret me. For some reason, we'll look at the interpretations that they give, and maybe then we'll be able to see why the rabbis are putting so much pressure on Vashti. Because we know, I mean, in the rabbinic story, her exit allows for Esther's entrance. So she does play a significant role, but it doesn't take a lot of time for her to play that role. Now, our method here again is we're going to read this like a poem. The rabbis were makers. They made things just like Rembrandt made things and Milton made things. The rabbis write this poetry, and when I say poetry, I don't mean it in such a way that we can say, oh, it's just poetry and we'll dismiss it. When our English professor says we read it as poetry, it means that we read it with the assumption that the person writing made certain choices when she or he wrote what they wrote. And we look to see how those choices influence meaning. I mean, right? That was literary theory 101. So she makes a banquet. So just like Achashverosh makes one, she makes one. And she feeds them minei gmayin ha'achil otan. So she feeds them, she had them eat all sorts of sweets. There is that sense of like fattening them up. And Rabbi Yitzchak says that very sweet things. So the question is, well, why is this? She's making a feast. It depends really how we look at her, what motivations we attribute to her. I don't know yet. So it says Beit Malchut. It was in the royal palace. So what does in the royal palace mean? Natna otan babatim meruvachim. Bimnesha darcha shel isha metzuya lekalkel. So it was in the royal house. And why in the royal house? I guess the question is, why in the royal house? Why in the king's house and not in the queen's house herself? I mean, that question is what will now allow the rabbis to answer. So they needed wide spaces. Why did they need wide spaces? Because women, what do? Women are mikukelet, that I'm just looking to see how this thing translates it. Oh, so it says, according to the way of women, which is to act disgracefully. So what is going on here? So the rabbis are suggesting here that the women are placed in this room, and they need to be placed in the room because they may be disgraced. They're going to have their period and they're going to be disgraced. Let's hold off on that for a second. I mean, Mitsuya lekalkel is, I mean, that has to be interpreted. I guess this is that she is menstruating is part of the rabbinic way of referring to that. Dover acher, beis malchus, nasna otan bebatim mitzior. Oh, so they put them in highly designed, like, you know, the art scroll says, in rooms with colored things in them, in nice places, in a very nice place. Damar Rabbi avon roitze isha shtia bebatim mitziorim ubedagim ubegadim mitziorim. So a woman likes, and this is not, from my point of view, an essential statement about women, but a statement about a certain class of women. So certain women, or women in general, maybe that's what Rabbi Yitzchak implies, they like nice clothing, and they like colorful, and they like elegance, right? And they like it better. Oh, they like it better than eating fattened calves. Agalim mifutamim. So, you know, I know this is like, so far where the rabbis are not winning any points in the feminism category, it doesn't seem. However, you know, I always say this when teaching classical texts to my students, that you see the way the women are represented, and often they're represented very, very poorly, often not. I mean, the greatest classical heroines, I think, are well, whatever. There are great women in classical literature, um, but the but the bad ones really are bad. But having said that, check out the guys in Homer, right? They're also not doing so well. So whenever we look at gender and its representation, we have to look at the two genders in reference to each other. So women like nice things, and it seems, according to the earlier perspectives, they like soft food, although here I think we're ready to go back to the first part of it and understand it a little bit better. Mine gamain achil otan, they were fed these things. She had them eat all sorts of sweets. To me, it looks like, well, if the women like these things, well, what do the men like? They like fattened calves. It seems like the men are looked at in relationship to the women as predators. And Vashti is fattening them up for the male predator. You think I'm being too hard on Vashti? Let's continue. Not nanota babet asplida shala. So they put her in the royal palace. Lomar she'im yimrod bala shel achat mehem tia ishto mibifnim natuno velo yimrod. So this is a third perspective, and this gives us another angle on Vashti. Why is she keeping the women in the palace? She's keeping, you have to, the way in which these stories are often rendered, usually for children, but the problem with Midrash is we don't grow out of the childish explanations, is that Esther remained, she was at Tzadikah. Of course, I guess your kid's in second grade. You're not going to say how the rabbis actually represent her, which is, I mean, she's just going back and forth between Achashverosh and Mordechai and having sex with him. That's Esther, right? So the story is the way the rabbis tell it is highly sexualized, right? And what's going on here is the women are being, and I think, again, we have to understand the mentality of the court that the rabbis are representing here. It's not the generic woman that the rabbis are representing here. That is the nakedness of them, and it's of course at the king's request, right? We're getting a picture of a very particular culture, and that is a culture of licentiousness and decadence and violence. And here is the violence. The women are being kept hostage, and she's acting on behalf of the king, so there will not be any rebellion in the kingdom. So here's Achashverosh really as a kind of fascist. So then there's a continuation. Rabbi Yudan v'Rabbi Levi b'shem Rabbi Yochanan kol makom shenamar b'Megillah zo melech Achashverosh, b'melech Achashverosh hakasav midaber kol makom shenamar lo melech stam mishamesh kadosh v'chol. So this last part that we have to take account of. This is just saying when different usages of the name Achashverosh imply or can imply different things. In one case, it implies the king himself. In other places, it describes both King Achashverosh and God. Let's go back to that. But I think once we read this third passage about Vashti, and we get maybe insight into the answer about how they were kept, how they're menstruating. Now, why would that be an embarrassment to them? So I think the reason is because Vashti, and I think I've seen other midrashim that suggest as much, that Vashti and Achashverosh are together in this, and they're sex traffickers, essentially. Or for me, the best way of understanding it is, or good way of understanding it is, that Achashverosh is Jeffrey Epstein, and she's the Ghislaine Maxwell, right? Ghislaine Maxwell, whatever her name is. And she procures women for him. And the reason that there is subject to embarrassment here is because they're all naked. Because that's what Vashti and Achashverosh, they are in league. And you can see they're in league also here by the end, by the last passage, that she's acting on his behalf as well. So let's look at the last verse, the last part here. Why, the question is, why is it included here? Why do we need to know this here? If what I said is right, and we're to read this as a poem, then what does this last part, how does it follow from what we've seen up until this point? One more time. Rabbi Yudan v'Rabbi Levi b'shem Rabbi Yochanan kol makom shenemar b'Megillah zo lemelech Achashveros zo lemelech Achashveros b'melech Achashveros hakotov medaber b'kol makom shenemar lemelech stam mishamesh kodesh kol. Okay, I mean that seems, I guess, so it's opening up the possibility, and we know from other parts of the Megillah that are better known, that's when the king is mentioned waking from his sleep, it refers to Achashverosh and also to God. But why are we getting that insight here? Does the word melech appear in the pasuk that got quoted? Mishamish kodesh v'chol. I don't know that idiom. It uses both code. It can be either kodesh or it can be chol. I just have something preliminary really to say, and you can't imagine a situation that's any more chol than this, meaning the way in which this scene is being described is really very much a scene of chol, and it of course is happening in the place of the king. And I guess maybe the underlining here is the rabbis are saying this is happening in the place of that king, and there will be another king who will make himself present in this story. Don't think you're going to be stuck with this king throughout the story. So just to recap, I think it's important that we know now we have a perspective. It's not the rabbis being sexist. I mean, the rabbis are representing a certain kind of toxic masculinity, and it's predatory. So it's really not about, as I understand certain feminists might want to read this, it's not about the rabbis' hatred for the feminine. It's the rabbis representing the extent of the decadence of this court. And it's kind of it bugs me that in like religious circles, this part of the story never gets emphasized. And I'm not saying, well, the rabbi should grow up and deal with sexuality. The rabbi should grow up and deal with sexuality. But one gets the sense of the distance that Jewish civilization has to travel to get away from this. The default is not sitting around a coffee table and discussing Jane Eyre. The default is a Martin Scorsese movie, right? We think that the default is, we're all just going to read Jane Eyre and everybody's going to live in the world in peace. Somehow, many of us, academics and intellectuals, have that idea when we're surrounded by so much violence and conflict. And part of understanding the necessity of civilization, and later on, I think very soon after this, it's going to say, well, the nations of the world, when they drink, they talk about sex, and when we drink, we praise God. And the reason we drink and praise God is because we have a culture and a civilization that is based upon the sacred text. And if you're an advocate of the sacred text, like religious people should be, see the distance from which we have to travel from Jeffrey Epstein's Shushan to get to where we are today. That was cool.